Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, pro-government troops in Syria have reinforced the Kurdish fighters in Afrin against a Turkish offensive. What repercussions will this battlefield alliance have on big power politics? Trump suggests arming teachers in response to the Parkland school shooting. Is a good guy with a gun enough to stop a bad guy with a gun, particularly in school? You're watching World Insight. Let's start in Syria, where pro-government popular forces entered Afrin to support Kurdish fighters against a Turkish military offensive. In response, Turkish troops escalated their air raids and shelling. Further south, pro-government forces continue to attack the rebel stronghold on the outskirts of the Syrian capital, Damascus. Situations are getting ever more intensive. Where is it heading for? Take a look at this first.
Shellings and airstrikes. These are happening in a so-called de-escalation zone. Dozens have been killed and wounded in Syria's eastern Ghouta over the past few days. Syria state media says more pro-government forces enter the northern region of Afrin to support the Kurdish militia. On the same day, Turkish forces intensified their air raids in the region. Turkish President Erdogan warned Syrian pro-government forces would pay a heavy price if they dare to support Kurdish forces. Ankara also said its offensive against Kurdish fighters in northern Syria was not over.
Turkey is testing the reactions from the Syrian government, Iran and Russia by targeting pro-Syrian government forces entering Afrin. I think Erdogan is only temporarily intensifying the situation to gain bigger bargaining chips in the future negotiations.
Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov called for dialogue between the Syrian government and the YPG. He also stressed that all interested parties should work together to prevent any attempts to deepen regional chaos.
As for the situation in Afrin and how possible it is to work towards its settlement, we've already said multiple times that any problems which now remain and even get sharper in Syria can be solved exclusively with respect to the territorial integrity of the Syrian Republic.
The UN also called for an immediate ceasefire in eastern Ghouta, and its children's agency UNICEF has expressed concern over the humanitarian situation. With renewed fighting near Damascus and the situation in Afrin, are there any prospects for a political solution to the Syrian conflict?
To find out, let's go to Tehran. We have Professor Hamed Mousawi, Professor of Political Science at the University of Tehran with us. And also joining us in Washington, D.C. in the U.S., Bülent Ali Reza, Director and Senior Associate for Turkey Project for the Center of Strategic and International Studies. Gentlemen, I want to welcome both of you with us. You are the experts in the field. Let's start with you, Professor Mousawi, the Vice Foreign Minister of Iran, talking about the fear of regional war. How far is it from reality?
Well, I mean, the developments in Syria are very worrying. In the past few months, there's been a lot of hope and expectation that a resolution of the conflict is within hand's reach, especially with the negotiations between Russia, Turkey, and Iran. Nevertheless, Turkey's offensive in the past month in northern Syria has essentially complicated negotiations. I want to point out that Turkey does have legitimate security concerns. I mean, Turkey has a Kurdish population of around 50 million, and the formation of a independent Kurdish state in northern Syria can be a threat to Turkey's national security. Nevertheless, I think we also have to acknowledge that Turkey does not really have the right to it, which still continues to be a sovereign state. So in that regard, Iran and Russia are worried. And if this situation escalates, of course, it's going to complicate negotiations further.
Right. Dr. Ali Reza, from the very beginning, a possible alliance among Russia, Turkey, and also Iran to where we are today, what have we missed?
Well, I mean, I think it's going too far to talk about an alliance. In essence, what we have is a working relationship between the three capitals, Tehran, Moscow, and Ankara. But let us remember that Iran and Russia backed Assad in the ongoing civil war, essentially allowed it to survive and to gain the upper hand, while Turkey, together initially with the Western countries, were backing the opposition forces. So I think to hear your Iranian guest talk about Turkey conducting operations in Syria as being unacceptable when Iran and Russia have been doing their best to actually participate in the civil war is, I think, somewhat ironic. Now, the Astana process that the three countries are engaged in essentially seeks to replace the moribund Geneva process that had previous backing under UN auspices, but it's essentially based on the premise that Assad will survive. And even though we're talking about the confliction zones, the escalation zones, it's still conducting operations that you referred to. And the fact that Turkey is conducting this operation in Afrin at the same time that Syria, backed by Russia and Iran, is conducting operations shows that there is a cynical kind of quid pro quo going on.
Before we talk about the cynicalness, in a way, to the other participant, let me ask you further, Dr. Alireza, about Turkey. You said very clearly in your answer that Turkey initially was supporting, together with some of the Western countries, the rebel forces, but we have seen some swaying of positions of Turkey, particularly after the Astana process. So are we seeing another change of mind from Turkey once again this time?
Not really, because in fact the forces who are fighting together with the Turkish army under the Free Syrian Army umbrella are very much linked to the opposition forces in Idlib that the Russian and Syrian air forces are bombing. And in fact, President Erdogan has said that after Afrin, Turkey will expand its operations to Idlib, presumably in support of the opposition. Now, I don't know whether he actually means that, and if he does, what will that do to his working relationship with Russia and Iran? But Turkey continues to say that Assad is illegitimate, refuses to engage in any kind of dialogue, and that's why it's so dangerous that Syrian forces, in fact, it's not just pro-Assad militias, but also mainland Syrian forces have apparently entered Afrin, which is a war zone.
All right. Professor Musawi, of course, we are talking about very different stances between Turkey and Iran, and it seems things are getting ever more driven the two countries apart. One of the most important things is the Kurdish issue you mentioned earlier, but the question is, when the Kurdish forces, fighters shall we say, inside Syria are fighting together with the government against the rebel forces, it is probably difficult for the government to say no and say you are our enemy. So in this regard, where is Iran?
I think Iran does recognize the, like I said, legitimate national security concerns of Turkey. We have to remember that Iran also does have a sizable Kurdish population within its territory. And like Turkey, Iran does not want an independent Kurdistan in northern Syria. So in that regards, Iran and Turkey actually agree on something. Nevertheless, I think Iran's position is that this issue should not be solved militarily, rather it can be negotiated. We have to remember that the Kurdish fighters in northern Syria are mainly supported, have been mainly supported by the United States. And that is a very complicating factor in all of this, because essentially their support, and they have also troops in northern Syria, has complicated this whole issue of Iran-Turkey relationship. Nevertheless, I think in the past month, Turkey has not really been able to achieve its objectives militarily. I won't say it hasn't been able to do anything, but nevertheless, I think even Turkey acknowledges the fact that there should be a political settlement to this.
Okay.
Nevertheless, like I said, the issue of the United States is going to be a complicating factor.
Got it. Dr. Alireza, you probably want to react to that. The enemy is not Iran, but rather the United States, the complicating factor.
Well, let's clarify. There are no U.S. troops in Afrin, which is now the focus for the Turkish military action. Now, Turkey has been engaged in talks with the United States about ending U.S. support for the YPG within the Syrian Democratic Forces organization. Now, I think the larger goal beyond Afrin for Turkey is to get the U.S. to actually remove its forces from at least Manbij, which is west of the Euphrates, and then, if possible, also move the YPG out of Manbij to east of the Euphrates, which is something that the U.S. and Turkey have talked about and have disagreed for some time. Now, the Russians themselves have a relationship with the Kurds. There is an office, PYD office, this is the parent organization of the YPG in Moscow. The Russians very much want to get them involved in a final peace process.
So, Dr. Alireza, you are suggesting that Turkey is having a problem both with the United States and Russia, right?
Absolutely.
All right.
Absolutely, but also...
go ahead, sir.
Go ahead.
Very briefly.
No, what I was going to say is that this operation would not have been possible for Turkey if Russia had not allowed the Turkish Air Force to actually conduct operations in Afrin before the ground troops began to move in.
All right.
The same thing happened with Euphrates Shield. So there's an arrangement with the Russians, but I think the Russians also want to make sure that the Afrin is not completely overrun by Turkey, so that the Kurds can actually cooperate with Russia in a final peace settlement.
Okay, you have demonstrated your points. Professor Musawi, Dr. Alireza is pointing to Russia now, suggesting probably that's even a bigger factor than the United States.
It's very true that the Russians are playing a very important role in Syria today. Like my colleague mentioned, Russia does have a relationship with the YPG, and also that is perhaps a complicating factor. Nevertheless, I think the difference is that the Russians want a political compromise to the situation, whereas I wouldn't necessarily agree that the Americans want that. The American support for the YPG has not only been a political relationship, they have actually armed the Kurds in northern Syria, supposedly to fight ISIS. Now that ISIS has been largely defeated, I think there should be pressure on the Americans to stop backing the Kurds militarily. Nevertheless, I think this points to the fact, and it's arguable, of whether the Americans want a political compromise to the Syrian conflict or not.
But Professor Musawi, if you said about that the ISIS has mainly been defeated, people would also question the role of Iran in Syria right now, because according to your vice foreign minister, the role of Iran is to defeat ISIS. Otherwise, the ISIS would come into Damascus and some of the other places of Iran, so places of Syria rather. So, Professor Musawi.
I think if we have to if we want to speak accurately, we have to acknowledge the fact that ISIS has been largely defeated. I'm not denying that there's no pocket of ISIS presence in Syria. Nevertheless, they are no longer a meaningful presence. Of course, we have other groups such as Al-Nusra Front, which is Al-Qaeda in Syria, so groups, dangerous terrorist groups such as that. But I think the issue of ISIS has been largely eliminated, and I think the excuse of arming the Kurds so that they defeat ISIS is no longer valid, and I think the Americans should, based on that fact, should no longer arm them.
Okay, here's the thing, gentlemen. We are coming almost to the end of this debate, but the most important thing is, are we still having the original goal, as all sides have reached a consensus in a way, that is The original goal is to get rid of ISIS as soon as possible from Syria and the other places surrounding. Well, at the same time, Assad will be the next issue to be discussed, even though there are different opinions. Dr. Ali Reza, which stage are we at now?
Well, the U.S. goal, as you say, was very much focused on getting rid of ISIS. Now they're trying to construct a new strategy, which will involve the Syrian Kurdish forces and somehow work out a relationship with Turkey for the post-ISIS future of Syria. Nonetheless, the U.S. has not accepted the Russian and Iranian position, which is that Assad will survive, the Assad regime will continue, and the opposition, which they have helped the Syrian government defeat, must accept this.
What about Turkey?
Until that is resolved.
What about Turkey? That is the most important thing.
Turkey also
Direct answer.
rejects. Well, Turkey is cooperating with Russia and Iran, but it still does not accept that Assad should continue. And that's the premise on which Astana is built.
Professor Moussaoui, where are we at? What is the end goal here?
I think, reaching a political compromise is going to be very difficult. Now, nevertheless, I would also like to point out that I think the key player here is going to be Turkey. In the past few months, there's been a sort of a rapprochement between Iran and Russia on the one hand and Turkey on the other. I think if Turkey is able to reach a compromise regarding the Kurds with Iran and Russia, then that would actually pave the way for a larger settlement regarding all of Syria. Nevertheless, the Americans are not really on the same page, either with the Iranians or Russians, or with the Turks for that matter.
Things are ever more complicated, particularly recently. But thank you so much for both of you with us, even though you have very different opinions toward the same issue. Hamed Moussaoui, Bulent Ali Reza. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us. Really appreciate it. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program.